welcome everybody who has missed the recording to our Early Start Australia webinar. And just as a quick catch up, right now we have with us Shannon Hallatt, who is one of our very experienced occupational therapists and also the regional manager for our Northern Territory and Tasmania teams. And Shannon is sharing with us today stories from the red dirt about some of the incredibly innovative services that we have been developing and really honing up in those remote and regional areas across Australia. Right, so moving along with our presentation today, Early Start Australia, we've just been talking about how we have got such a variety of services, but how our values of bringing in evidence-based practice and empowering our clients, whether they be the children we work with, the families we work with, or the young adults we work with, really brings home why cultural sensitivity is so important and why we need to acknowledge everybody's particular cultural experiences and background and families, and bringing our services to life with them. And I think that is reflected in our values as well. Above all, we love family. We try and promote a sense of inclusivity, integrity, and innovation in what we do. And I know we've already just chatted a lot about best practice, Shannon. I'm looking forward to exploring that more about how that looks for regional and remote areas as well. And I think you'll see from some of the incredible photos that Shannon will share with you today, how much fun we have while we're doing it.
Definitely.
Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Shannon to start this lovely webinar. I'm really looking forward to hearing about how things are going. Remember that you are welcome to pop any questions you have into the Q&A box, and we will address them as we go. And then from there, at the end, we'll have a lovely discussion about some of the issues that have been raised. And please don't worry if we don't get to your question. We will include the answers in the Q&A sheet as a part of the package you'll get for registering for the webinar. So I'll hand over to you now, Shannon.
Thank you, Holly. As we've discussed, this is a topic that's really close to my heart, and it is absolutely a discussion. I am going to ask for some contributions, and that's an acknowledgement of the fact that although I am a country kid and I've grown up in the bush, we are all still learning, and I would never claim to be an expert in cultural practice. Because I think that it's a journey that we walk together, and it is important that we acknowledge that we are all still learning and striving to do the best that we can every day. Go to the next slide. Thanks, Holly. So why is this important? So nationally, around 3.8% of the recorded population are First Nations people. Around 300,000 of these people are under the age of 15, and you can see that we have around 150 recorded languages spoken. Additionally, 23% of our population are culturally and linguistically diverse. So of the 610,000 people with an NDIS plan, 10% are First Nations people, and this actually goes up to 50% in the Northern Territory. Around 8% of people are also culturally and linguistically diverse. So as you can see, this represents around 100,000 people with an NDIS plan for whom cultural safety is absolutely essential. We can also see that the rate of disability is significantly higher in First Nations and migrant peoples than in the wider population. In the NT, for example, around 30% of the population are Indigenous, yet they represent 50% of people with an NDIS plan. Now, largely, health and disability services are inaccessible for First Nations people, with barriers including services not being available in their local area, difficulty accessing these services. Sometimes there are out-of-pocket expenses, there may be waiting times, but most notably, First Nations people report that services just aren't culturally safe and responsive, especially in the health space. So improving the cultural safety and the cultural responsiveness of the health system can improve access to and the quality of healthcare for Indigenous Australians. A culturally safe health system is one that respects Indigenous cultural values, strengths and differences, and proactively addresses racism and inequity. It also requires health professionals and health services to be culturally responsive, to take action to overcome racism and power imbalances, and to have active engagement with Indigenous clients to ensure that the system meets their needs. So part of building a culturally safe service is workforce diversity and inclusion. And this includes people of various ages, gender identity, ability, and cultural background. So in a space where we have a chronic allied health care workforce shortage, this challenge of diversity is even more amplified. We have 200,000 practicing allied health providers in the country, and that is across all areas of service, including health, education, disability, management, rehab, mental health, mining, acute services, and aged care, and probably many more. Now, remembering that 10% up to 50% of NDIS participants, so around 60,000 people, and 3.8% of the general population are Indigenous, we only have around 2,400 First Nations allied health providers. It cannot be the responsibility of First Nations allied health providers to be the drivers for culturally safe services within organisations or as separate organisations. And we all have a responsibility to be learning and sharing in a way that contributes to positive social change and outcomes for the people and the communities that we support. So one of the ways to do this is actually through best practice. So I would love everyone to jump into the Q&A and just take a moment to share with us, what do you consider to be best practice when supporting your clients?
So Maureen has shared with us that it's evidence-based at her service. Asya has said that they take a holistic approach. Aaron says listening to them and their needs or goals and their environmental context that care would be done in. We have client-centered goals. We have family culture and values, understanding what is important. Relationship building, family-centered goals. Listening and trusting clients' lived experiences from Erin. Gosh, this is just exploding. Wow, this is a great response. Best practice to me, says Heidi, is a client-centered and holistic approach to health and well-being based in evidence. To be respectful and client-centered, taking the time to understand the client's needs, asking their preference for service delivery, the children's voices, that's a good one. And lived experiences, yes, from Julianne.
Wonderful. There's some really fantastic suggestions in there, and great to hear that so many great things happening all around the country. So the good news is that best practice is universal. It cuts across all levels of diversity, as it's based on human rights, equity, and holistic service provision. So best practice tells us that services should be family and client-centered. And many of you popped that in, which is fantastic. This means that we put aside our background, our upbringing, and our own beliefs. We lead with curiosity to respectfully listen and learn about what is really important to the family that we are supporting. Now, living and working in the Northern Territory, my teams have always worked from the belief that our individual backgrounds are likely to be different to the family we are supporting. Now, you've probably heard Darwin referred to as the melting pot of culture. And while it's literally a melting pot for much of the year, the statement is true. But it means that for every family, it's essential we are considerate, curious, and focused on what is important to the family, to the child, and to their community. Whether they are Larrakia, the traditional owners of the Darwin area, or another family grouping, whether they are Greek, Vietnamese, African, Indian, we cannot make assumptions about the family. We must be safe, sensitive, and family focused in our approach. We consider the child in the broader context of their family, their school, and their community. So looking at what are the innate strengths of the family? You know, what is their history? What traumas have they endured and overcome? Who's in their cheer squad? And what are those socioeconomic barriers that they have to work to overcome? Collaboration and co-design. It's become a little bit of a buzzword in the NDIS, I think, but actually true collaboration can only come from a foundation of respect and a deep trust that we are there to support the child, the client, and their family to achieve their goals. Co-design is not effective if the person we're supporting doesn't feel safe to share their goals, their fears, and their dreams with us. So investing in relationship and consistently showing up is essential to the success of the therapy service. Co-design must include the wider network and build the capacity in all of the people around the child, and feel empowering for families so they may take the lead in the therapy relationship. Now, quite a few people mentioned this, which was great, but services are best delivered in the child's everyday environment and with the people in their everyday life. Now, interestingly, some research shows us that when a caregiver sees a provider, a therapist, delivering a support in their daily environment, so like their home, for example, it actually results in a lower sense of efficacy for the caregiver. So if, as a therapist, we go and provide a therapy service with a child, with the caregiver watching on, it actually reduces their confidence and their competence in supporting that particular approach. When we can coach and support a caregiver to use a strategy effectively, they are much more likely to implement this when we are not around, because they feel empowered and confident to follow through. Now, sometimes environments of comfort and safety can look very different. So it might be meeting at a playgroup or a play centre, meeting at the park or at the BMX track. Quite often it's sitting in the front yard under a tree. Now, I can tell you I've seen some pretty interesting risk management plans in the top end. And even a few near miss incidents with green tree snakes and cheeky dogs out in community. But it all contributes to building safety and trust in the therapy relationship. And lastly, but most importantly, relationships are the key. Having a coordinated team approach with a lead practitioner or a key worker, or a contact person such as an allied health assistant from your team. Sometimes the family may even wish to have an external source of support or a key contact, like a support coordinator or a teacher or a liaison person from their local school who can assist them with managing their therapy journey. Let's have a look at some additional initiatives that we could think about. So diversity in our workforce that is representative of your local community. So a workforce that provides a familiar face or a familiar voice for families when they are engaging in your service. We can look to allied health assistants and key workers as a way to build diversity and perspective into our teams and to provide that familiar face for our clients. We know that there are many barriers for our First Nations young people to go on to tertiary education and complete an allied health degree. Yet there are many roles that we can grow to boost our workforce and health careers while these pathways are being developed and strengthened. So I would really encourage you to look at Indigenous Allied Health Australia, or IHA, and particularly their training academies, which are available in the Northern Territory, ACT, and New South Wales, along with Marmurich in WA. And if you have any other great training organisations or programs that you know of, please add them to the Q&A and we will share that information with the group after the session. You can work to create linkages with Aboriginal controlled health organisations and Aboriginal controlled community organisations as a point of information, of learning, of trust, and to really understand what are the needs of the families in your community, what services are they looking for, and how would they like these services to be delivered or provided. Cultural training is always number one on the list when we're looking at cultural sensitivity and culturally safe services. So there are many options for this. The most essential piece of information that I can share with you from my experience is that cultural training is not a one and done module. It has to be a lifelong pursuit. And the more you learn, the less you will actually know. So my call to action for you is to consciously choose an open mind and an open heart to make your own decisions, to overcome cultural bias, and to challenge your own assumptions when they creep up on you. If you are looking for training, I highly recommend IHA. They have a 3-part training series, which is very high quality. And Your Mob Learning also have some wonderful training resources available. I also encourage you to go on local tours, visit the local visitors centre, and learn more about your local area and the local families, because there's such a richness of information that you can get by really looking local. Respecting the cultural view of disability, and learn what this means for each family that you are working. For Indigenous families, particularly, understanding shame, trauma, and vulnerability that comes with engaging with health and disability services. There's an unfortunate paradox that many families face when their children are being measured by Western developmental and educational standards, where Indigenous families are treated differently by child protection services and by maternal and child health systems. And when navigating systems like the NDIS can be incredibly difficult if their perspective of disability is not actually consistent with the system itself. And lastly, remembering that as a provider, we have the opportunity to contribute to real social change. Now, that is, if we contribute to the capacity of the people around the child, we build the capacity of people around every child. We help the children who aren't yet able to access services for all of the reasons. We help the children whose family aren't quite ready, or all of the children on waiting lists. We help the mum, the auntie, the educators, the teachers, and they help every other child they come into contact with. Through putting on a lens of collectivist culture and bridging the gap between collectivism and the very individualized NDIS, we can actually make a wider collective difference. So an example of this is when we're working in a community, for example, or even in Darwin, where we have very extensive wait lists, we will try to have, one therapist, for example, visiting a school and working with the teacher specifically for the children who have NDIS supports, but also looking at how do those strategies translate into supports for the whole class. Because we know there's a really good chance there's probably another 5 children in the class who would benefit from those supports. Now, NDIS processes are largely not culturally accessible. So throwing back over to you, in the Q&A, I would love for you to share what are some of the strategies that you have implemented or would like to trial within your service to try to bridge the gap or to make your services more culturally safe.
There has been some really interesting things done, I guess, internally. And I know that there'll be many speech pathologists watching today who will have had a lot of cultural training and support through their professional body. And I wonder if that's something that your team, for all those watching out there, has incorporated into your broader team environment as well.
Information, the presentation of information is a great opportunity. If anyone has looked at how they are providing information to clients or how they are goal setting.
Lara shared with us that in their service, they are honest and genuine, and they come in without expectations. They remember that each family has their own values and there is not a one size fits all.
Wonderful. That's really great to hear, Lara. Thank you for sharing.
And thank you for being the first one to share as well. Thank you, Azia, as well. Azia has written, letting parents and the carer be the peer worker, as they are the best advocates for the child or the one under their care.
Wonderful.
And Susan says she is a student at SCU and so yet to engage in a work environment around cultural sensitivity, but she's super interested in the topic. And I wonder if there's been much discussion around this at university for you, Susan. I've currently got a number of speech pathology students, 4 of them working with me, in fact, and they have all had different levels, because they go to different universities, of cultural awareness discussion and training. And it's really interesting to see the different approaches from the different states that they are training in. And we also have Anna, who says it's important to think of assessments as well. Not all standardized assessments are culturally safe. My goodness, yes.
Absolutely. And there are some assessment tools that are really fantastic. And so I will comment on those when we do the Q&A, because I think it is an important area. But yes, correct. Standardized assessments are not valid for Indigenous children. There is one that is currently in development, which is very, very exciting. So if you are looking for a place to start, the ASQ Tracks is a variation of the ASQ. It is a screening assessment, but it does have some developmental norms associated with it. And there is a development project that's sitting alongside that as a practitioner assessment that is standardized for Indigenous children. It's a few years away, but we're very excited about that one.
That will be a game changer, I'm sure. Yeah. Gosh, we have so many people who are students in the chat who are saying that they've had varying levels of cultural awareness and sensitivity training, from virtually nothing right through to entire units. And someone's even done the IHA training already and loved it, which is great. I found that training really good too.
Heidi's a top-end student, so hi and welcome.
Fantastic. Gosh, it would be really interesting to see where everyone's from around the country, actually. I'd be very, very keen to know. Okay, so we might hop over to the next slide and keep going, Shannon.
Yes, and everyone, please feel free to keep popping your suggestions in there. Hopefully I'll trigger an idea that you feel the urge to share. So really, this is an opportunity for us to help to bridge the gap. So as I mentioned, Indigenous cultures and many other cultures that are people that are relatively new to Australia do actually have quite a collectivist view. And we know that the NDIS is very individualized. and very individualistic. So it's an opportunity for us to also overlay a time is money system in the NDIS with a culture where often time is quite a fluid construct. So it's a challenge that needs a lot of creativity, but there's huge opportunity here. So one of the ways that we can do this is start to look at how we are presenting information to families. So things like recording videos and sending them via a text message if we can, where we're talking through what do services look like? What is a service agreement? And even down to a video of the practitioner who they might be seeing on the day, a little about them and what they do, what they can support with, where they are from. It just helps to create that relationship early on and to make sure that we are actually gaining informed consent through the process. We can access local services or trusted community members, especially when we are looking at consent. So tapping into those community organisations through a coordinator of supports, if there is a strong relationship there. There are organisations in Queensland who, for example, are acting as an interface between the local partner in community and families who are being referred in. We can talk to a liaison person at the local school. Often it's the front office lady who might actually be our community connection. But understanding that quite often our connection isn't direct with the family. It may actually be direct through a third party. Another point on consent, because this comes up a lot, and with the NDIS, we do have to have consent and service agreements before we even engage with a family. So often it's about establishing a relationship and understanding who in the family actually has authorization within the kinship system to give consent for this service to engage. Now, sometimes it is not parent. Now, this is where the NDIS rules can be a little challenging to navigate, but if you know that actually grandma or auntie is the one who makes the decisions for the child, that you can gain consent from them because they have the cultural authority to provide it. And we do have examples of this. We had a young boy over on the Tiwi Islands, actually, so about 45-minute flight to the north of WA. You may have heard about their football team. They're, always in the news because they're amazing. But one of our therapists was seeing a young boy and his cousin brother was referred. So the therapist said, I don't really have a relationship with that mum. How would you suggest I go about that? So the conversation went something like, who do you have a relationship with for the other child? And she said, well, grandma. I said, then that's who you talk to. And it sounds very simple, but it's a different way of thinking about it. Grandma was actually an elder in the community, and she had the cultural authority to actually make decisions about the cousin brother of the first child. And what a wonderful way that we could help to engage the mum of the new child by talking to someone who we already have a relationship and trusts us to then support the new child coming into our service. So visual supports are a really wonderful way that you can talk about goal setting. And sometimes it can be a little uncomfortable to take notes. As you would know, many Indigenous cultures are very strongly based on verbal communication and listening and sensing and feeling, but you can use a notebook to draw pictures and engage the child with drawing pictures about what would you like to work on? What's hard for you? What can we help with? What are you really good at? And a lot of children will tap into that artistry and start to tell stories through pictures. So while we don't necessarily want to be writing reams and reams of notes, actually using art and using drawing as a way to communicate goals can be really powerful. And then looking at adjusting your service locations, like we mentioned, sometimes it's sitting under a tree, appointment lengths, and who's in the room. So there was, I remember I went down to Catherine once, and I had arranged for mum and child to come and see me. I was working out of the doctor's clinic, and that was a safe place for them. And it was a little earlier on in my career, but I was expecting mum and child, but I actually had 2 aunties and 2 grandmas also come along to the appointment. So we had 6 adults in the room and the child. So it was actually a really rich opportunity to get a lot of information, but also to share very respectfully around, well, maybe like, is this something that you want to work on? And how does this work when he's with you? And what about when he's at your place? And what about at your place? So we could get, broad capacity building, and everyone was on the same page about what they wanted to help the child with and what they felt would work within their environment. Awareness of men's and women's business is really important when we are supporting Indigenous families, and also in some other cultures, that there are topics that are taboo for women to be discussing with men and men with women, and particularly after a certain age. So we had a 13-year-old boy working with us with a female key worker, and the support coordinator asked her to actually talk to the boy about his toileting and to provide some strategies for him to be more independent in his toileting. Now, recognizing that that was not appropriate, the key worker, actually went and talked to a local liaison person, a tutor at his school who was an Indigenous man, and asked him, is this something that you can support him with? And would it be okay if we talked about some of the strategies that you might be then feel comfortable sharing with him? And because it was at that professional level, some of those taboo topics are a little less taboo at a professional level. And that support person was then able to support the boy to implement those strategies in his daily life. Now, yarning is basically having a chat before we get down to business. So we might like to call it small talk, but it's really important in building rapport. Sometimes when we're working with a family, we may take 3 to 5 minutes to establish a relationship, and then we're straight into it. With someone who has maybe had difficult experiences with health and disability or are starting on their journey, we may actually need to do this for 2 or 3 sessions. Now, there are informal protocols when you are meeting with an Indigenous person, and that includes identifying where on country you are from. If you have any Indigenous family, whether they are by blood or by marriage, or by, chosen family, which I think is the best kind sometimes, sharing a little about yourself, as much as you're comfortable with in your professional role. And you want to also provide space and silence for the other person to share if they feel ready. Some of the things I found helpful is maybe to show a photo of my kids or your pets, depending on, where you are and what's around. Maybe sharing a little about the places you've lived, maybe places on country you have visited and loved. or being careful to maintain confidentiality. You may also let them know about someone that they know who you have supported. Or you can ask, hey, do you know anyone who's come here? Common ground between you. Okay? So I would say something like, hi, but I'm from WA, and I've got some family who are Yamaji and also Noongar. So that's the Gascoyne region, and also down around the Midwest and Perth regions. I might say something like, oh yeah, I got 2 little kids. They're cheeky. They like to go swimming when it's so hot. What about whatever the child's name is? So you can just do it in a way that is quite relaxed. And often once you create that connection, or say, oh yeah, I know someone who has that last name, you may actually find that you have a connection somewhere back in time, and that means a lot when we're working with a family. And lastly, we want to make sure that we just slow down the whole process, okay? It's about the process and not the product. So while it might take extra time to achieve the goals in the NDIS plan or in your therapy plan, the impact for the child, for the family, and for that community will actually be monumental. So we're going to throw it open again to anyone who might have any questions. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so please throw them at me. Any thoughts that you'd like to share, any resources, any questions?
Goodness me, haven't we covered a lot? That's a huge amount of information. Thank you so much, Shannon. I really loved hearing about how the team has interacted with different communities. I think that's something that, and I'm assuming because we do have particularly a lot of students watching today, that's something that they may not have experienced yet. And so knowing where to start and how to build those connections, I really find is key to establishing yourself in any community, whether they are of an Indigenous cultural background or any community. We certainly down here in Tassie, there's a lot of work with people who are refugees. So there's a huge amount of cultural diversity going on.
Absolutely.
Just to reassure everybody as well too, we'll make sure in our post-webinar package that we include some links for organisations like the Indigenous Allied Health Australia, IHA, that we keep referring to.
Yes. I think when establishing yourself in a community, it's really about doing a survey. I have seen over the last 15 years in the Northern Territory, a lot of people just sort of blow in and come in with all of the best intentions, and I respect that, but it can fall over very quickly. And what that does is it actually damages the health system, essentially, the health and disability system, because in my opinion, first-year therapists should not be doing remote services unless they have an incredibly supportive team and have probably grown up in the area, because there is so much complexity in providing those services that it does actually take a really long time to understand how to navigate that. And often there will be services who are already there who can actually provide information and support to make sure that the services are safe, they are effective, and that they are working on the things that are actually important to the client.
So Heidi has asked, I just wanted to ask, and this really taps into what you've just been saying, Shannon, did you go straight from working with remote I'm assuming, to remote clientele, or did you first gain experience from working in clinical practice, for example, in hospitals?
So I went straight into a community primary health service down in the southwest of WA. So it was more rural than remote. And then similarly, in my next job, it was more rural, a little remote. So I definitely had that experience of a transition, essentially, and then went into larger remote communities, so where there is infrastructure and health systems. So for me, it was a really gradual transition. I think to go from something like an acute straight into a very, very remote community, so it's called an MMM7 zone, that would be very, very difficult. And I think ultimately, when we throw practitioners into environments like that, it's not good for the practitioner and it's not good for the client. I do see it happening a lot, and I just think it's not an ideal situation for anyone.
It does have a ripple effect through the community, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So I would definitely recommend getting some kind of experience in a more urban or rural type of environment. And look, Darwin's rural, really. Or Alice Springs is probably borderline remote. I do think it's worth getting that experience first.
Thank you. And now we have Susan, who says, I would love to hear how you have dealt with real life situations when things go wrong, perhaps when cultural boundaries are unconsciously crossed or sensitivities not understood and the relationship breaks down.
There's a lot of humility in culturally safe services, and an apology goes a very long way. So if that person has completely lost contact, then it can be difficult to try to repair that relationship. And that's where your networks can really be helpful. But I do think if you know that you've crossed the line without intending to, and I have made mistakes, saying people's names wrong or do it's just really important to say, I know that I did X, Y, and Z, and I'm really sorry if that wasn't okay, or if that upset you in any way. I didn't mean to do that, and I'd really love to learn what I could do better next time. Would you be okay to share that with me, or is there someone I can talk to so I know how to do better next time around?
Thanks, Shannon. We have a comment from Erin as well, a question from Erin. What can we do as health professionals to advocate for Indigenous rights?
Oh,
that's
Erin,
a big
good
one.
Question.
That is a big one.
It is a big one, and I've got some examples here. So I think as health professionals, we do have a lot of sway. Now, there's definitely been some dilution of that within the NDIS. And I think it probably depends as well which system you are working in. So absolutely, I think we advocate as fiercely as we would for every client. And especially when we're in the NDIA, talking about why goals are not appropriate, or why this goal couldn't actually be met, why services needed to be delivered in this way. Because we do have a powerful voice. And when we're advocating for it as being a client-centered service, and especially around participant choice and control, that's where we can use our voice as our advocate for our client.
I think that's a good one, because we don't just have a lot of influence within the healthcare world, but we can also advocate across all sorts of community organisations as well. So that's a very, very good answer, Shannon. Okay, so we also now have a question from Candy. How do you navigate the hours with NDIS plans when extra time is required to build that relationship?
We are really open and transparent about how many hours we expect to take. Most of our clients, especially in a remote community, they would be having a coordinator of supports in their team. So it is a lot of advocacy actually around why services should be structured with a key worker, for example, rather than 4 different practitioners. And ultimately, we include the hours that it is going to take or what we expect. If time is tight, if the NDIS plans are tight, I actually think it's better value for us to use those hours to build a trusting relationship and because that allows us to then get a really clear understanding of what the family want, what the family are looking for, and what the child wants. And that lets us then advocate back with a change in circumstance form, for example, or a request for a plan review, because we've actually utilized that time to get a really good source of information and truth that we can advocate back.
That's true. It's difficult to do that if all you've done is a formal assessment that sometimes is completely irrelevant to what's going on and you don't understand the problem yourself.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. We also have another question from Aaron. Would there be issues with being a male worker in the area working with children if it's seen as women's business?
That's a great question, Aaron. There can be. And that's where it's important to be aware and offer the choice. And it's more so if you're starting to, as an OT, for example, if you were talking about toileting, that could be an area that's a little bit sensitive. If there's the opportunity to have a female worker with you, that is ideal. So it might be an Aboriginal health worker or an Indigenous allied health assistant, a teacher. If there's someone else there who can help to bridge that gap, then that can make it okay. But ultimately, you will know if the family are uncomfortable. Typically, they will disengage at that point. But it's just about offering a choice. And if you're not sure, try to have a female in the room if you're going for a subject that you think might be a little bit unclear or a bit grey.
I've also found it quite useful to ask the family as well whether this is something that in their culture needs to be dealt with by somebody else. That can be quite a good thing to do.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions asking about placements or all sorts of other things in there. So Sarah asks, is it possible to do a placement in Northern Territory communities?
So this depends on the organisation. So there are organisations who take placements and things like work shadowing in Darwin, Katherine, Alice Springs, and Nhulunbuy. So they are the bigger centres, and they have tertiary facilities. You wouldn't typically be able to go to a very remote community on a placement, only because that relationship can be a little tender. So sometimes, yes, depending on the community, but I wouldn't take it as a given that you're going to go out necessarily if you're in the Northern Territory. But you can still get really good rural experience by going to those other places. So I know, for example, Flinders down in Katherine actually have a placement program where they have students based out of school, and then they have a supervisor who is supervising those speech pathology students working in the school in the wider Katherine community. And those speeches have a great time.
They certainly do. Sarah also asked, do we take new graduates?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said, the remote experience isn't something that happens straight off the bat with us. We have had 6 month people go out around 6 months, but they are people who, you know, have grown up in the area or, you know, from a country area and are showing us that they're going to be okay. But it's absolutely a goal of many people in the Northern Territory is to get out there and experience what it's like in the community. So absolutely.
And you probably saw, Sarah, a couple of slides ago, we at ESA actually do have a new graduate program that can support our graduates to work in any of the clinics that we have around Australia. So there is more information on that in your information pack that's coming to you if you would like to know. You'll find all of our contact details on our socials there, and you can follow Early Start Australia for more information as well, including about our up and coming webinars. And we really do have some great ones coming your way. So we have a webinar coming up in December, which is based around hints and tips for our clients who are approaching the holiday season, which is not called the silly season for no reason. And that is going to be a fantastic resource for you to watch as a professional, because there'll be some wonderful hints and tips in there for you as well, for you to support your clients with, but also potentially for you to share with your clients ahead of the holiday rush. So we hope to see you there, and again in January, where we continue exploring our topics around autism and supporting families who are going through ongoing support issues or those first stages post-diagnosis, where we're joined by another one of our amazing ESA team, Dr. Nicole Grant, who will be speaking on that topic. So thank you so much, Shannon, for taking us through your rich experience. Just amazing to hear about. And thank you everybody for joining us. And of course, we will send you through your webinar pack at the end with your Q&A responses and also further information. And we'll make sure we pop the information about IHA on there as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Nice to see you.